What if I told you that some of the biggest economic collapses in Latin America were not accidents? What if behind the riots, the soaring inflation, the lost decades, and the political upheaval, there was a financial blueprint approved by economists, executed by governments, and enforced by one of the most powerful institutions on earth? Because for decades, the IMF claimed it was saving Latin America. But what if the real story is exactly the opposite? Today, we're uncovering the shocking truth hidden behind closed-door negotiations, structural reforms, and loans that came with invisible chains that reshaped entire societies. This is the story you were never meant to hear. This is how the IMF broke Latin America. Before the IMF became a household name in Latin America, the region was already standing on unstable ground. The 1950s to 1970s were a time of ambition. Many Latin American nations wanted to industrialize, compete globally, and escape centuries of economic dependency. Governments borrowed billions from international banks to build highways, steel plants, and national industries. Money was cheap, growth was fast, the future looked unstoppable, but there was a hidden flaw, a flaw no one could see until it was too late. Most loans were issued with variable interest rates, meaning when the global economy shifted, the cost of debt would skyrocket. And that shift began in 1979, when U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to fight inflation. Almost overnight, Latin America's debt tripled without a single dollar being borrowed. Countries panicked. Banks wanted their money back. Inflation surged. Imports became unaffordable. This was the moment Latin America needed help, and someone stepped in, an institution promising stability, credibility, and salvation. Enter the International Monetary Fund. But this rescue came with fine print. The year is 1982. Mexico shocks the world. It announces it cannot pay its $80 billion foreign debt. This was the financial earthquake that shook the entire region. If Mexico fell, banks feared Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and others would follow. Global panic, market collapse, a potential financial apocalypse. So the IMF devised a Plan 1 that would define the next 4 decades of Latin American history. But here's where the twist begins. The IMF didn't just offer loans, it demanded control. Countries needed cash fast, but the IMF said, you can borrow, but only if you follow our program. And these programs, called structural adjustment programs, became the most controversial financial experiments ever conducted on developing nations. The IMF believed Latin America's problem was clear. Governments overspent, public sectors were bloated, currencies were too strong, and markets were too protected. Its solution? A radical economic surgery. The IMF's conditions were always presented as rational, modern, and necessary. But in reality, they reshaped entire countries overnight. IMF condition number 1: devalue the currency. The goal: make exports cheaper and boost competitiveness. The effect: instant inflation as imports became unaffordable. IMF condition number 2: cut public spending, remove subsidies, shrink government programs, reduce social services. The effect: unemployment, rising poverty, and political anger. IMF condition number 3: privatize state-owned companies, sell telecom, water, electricity, mines, railways, often sold to foreign corporations at bargain prices. The effect: loss of national industries and long-term profits. IMF condition: cut tariffs, remove trade protections. The effect: domestic industries collapsed, unable to compete with cheaper foreign imports. For IMF economists, these policies made perfect theoretical sense, but for millions of people living in Latin America, life changed overnight. If this were just an economic story, it would be complicated. But this is a human story, a painful one. Argentina, the IMF's biggest failure throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Argentina followed IMF programs almost religiously. Each time the economy collapsed, the IMF said, you didn't go far enough. The result: unemployment soared, pensions were slashed, inflation became hyperinflation, poverty exploded from 4% to over 40%. In 2001, Argentina defaulted on $100 billion, the largest sovereign default in history. Citizens chanted in the streets, "Que se vayan todos." Everyone must go. Because trust wasn't just broken, it was shattered. Bolivia, the shock therapy experiment. Bolivia became an economic laboratory. In 1985, under pressure from the IMF, it executed one of the most extreme shock therapy programs ever attempted. Overnight, prices increased by 20,000%. Massive layoffs hit miners and factory workers. Entire industries collapsed, social unrest exploded, economists applauded the reforms. Workers buried the cost. Brazil, the endless debt spiral. Brazil took IMF loans repeatedly from 1983 to 1998. Each time borrow gives, cut spending, gives, economy shrinks, gives, borrow again. A loop with no exit, a dependency cycle disguised as rescue. The 1980s are now known as Latin America's lost decade. Not because nothing happened, but because so much was lost. GDP growth collapsed, inflation destroyed, savings, real wages fell as much as 30 to 40%. Millions fell into poverty, political instability swept the region. The paradox: countries adopted IMF policies to reduce debt, yet total debt tripled during IMF management. How? Because economies shrank faster than they could repay. The IMF solution: more loans, with more conditions. It was a financial treadmill. No matter how fast countries ran, they stayed in the same place or fell further behind. This was not stabilization. It was stagnation, packaged as reform. Throughout the 1990s, the IMF doubled down. Countries like Argentina, again, Ecuador, Jamaica, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Kenya, in danger, are facing nearly identical conditions to the 1980s. High dollar-denominated debt, weak local currencies. Dependency on foreign loans, social unrest, due to austerity, rising poverty, political instability, the same cycle, same solutions, same outcomes. For example, Argentina 2018-2023. The IMF gave Argentina its largest loan ever, $57 billion. The result: inflation above 200%, currency collapse, rising poverty, no economic stability, another loop, another crisis. Ecuador's IMF deal 2019 IMF loan, $4.2 billion, condition: remove fuel subsidies. Outcome: violent nationwide protests, government declared a state of emergency. History didn't just repeat, it accelerated. And yet, the public narrative remains unchanged. The IMF is here to help, but help for who? The people, or the creditors waiting to be repaid? The IMF wasn't evil, it wasn't malicious, but it was wrong, catastrophically wrong. Its biggest mistakes: 1. One-size-fits-all economics. The IMF assumed poor countries should adopt the same policies as wealthy nations. But developing economies are different, more fragile, more unequal, more politically volatile. 2. Cutting spending during recession, austerity during crisis is like removing blood during surgery. Recovery becomes impossible. 3. Ignoring social consequences, protests, revolutions, political collapse. These were predictable outcomes. The IMF dismissed them as external factors. 4. Protecting creditors. First, the IMF prioritized repayment to foreign banks over national stability. 5. Misreading inflation causes. Inflation in Latin America was often caused by debt and currency shocks, not government overspending, yet the IMF treated every case the same. The result: a region still fighting the ghosts of policies imposed decades ago. Today, if you travel across Latin America, you'll feel something strange, a skepticism, a bitterness, a quiet memory of promises that never. Ask people what caused the lost decade, and many won't mention the IMF directly. But they'll describe its effects: salaries that never recovered, industries that never came back, institutions that remain weak, a distrust of foreign intervention, generations forced to migrate, a region still rebuilding confidence because the IMF didn't just reshape economies, it reshaped destinies. And here's the chilling part: most of this history remains unknown to the world, almost as if it was never meant to be told. Takeaway number 1: not all help is help. Some loans stabilize, others create dependency. The difference lies in the conditions, not the money. Takeaway number 2: economic models can fail entire regions. The IMF's approach was not just wrong for a country, it was wrong for an entire continent. Takeaway number 3: history